snatch it back and hold it, baby, one more time.
This is the start of a new series where I want to take an in-depth look at various amp models. The approach will be to look at the overall capabilities of the amplifier, then depending on the amp, use a variety of settings that are just for the amplifier itself, and then finally we'll look at sculpting that sound inside the Amplitube standalone application by looking at cabinets and rooms and microphones and pedal effects and rack effects and all of that. I'm starting with a fairly complicated amp, the Mesa Boogie Mark IV. So this video will span several episodes. Let's go deep. During my initial experiments with Amplitube, I came across the Mesa Boogie amps. When I saw the Mark IV, I was immediately intimidated. As a relatively new guitar player, there seemed to be an awful lot of controls here. The amp sent me running for the safety of the 57 Champ and its one knob. Eventually, I dipped a toe into the boogie waters and played around with the Transatlantic TA30. I liked the sound of that amp, and it made me brave enough to approach the Mark IV again. Let's start with the front panel. The Mark IV has three distinct channels, Rhythm 1, Rhythm 2, and Lead. On the left third or so, you have the gain and tone control area for all three channels. Rhythm 1 and 2 are on top, and the lead controls are all on the bottom of this section. Moving to the middle third, we have the presence and master volume controls with presence on top, and the master volume controls on the bottom. Each channel gets a vertical column here, so Rhythm 1, Rhythm 2, and the lead channel. Finally, to the right, we have a 5-band equalizer that affects all the channels. First, let me talk about the mechanics. In the real amp, some of the knobs can be pulled. In the simulation, you click on the LED to pull the knob. The knob graphic changes to indicate it is pulled, but the LED also lights up. Time for funny quirk sidebar number 1. There are 6 of these pull switches. On the interface, 4 of them affect the knob to the left. You will be forgiven for thinking that all 6 of them would affect the knob on the left, but for the 2 presence controls, they affect the knob to the right. I like to imagine that the person responsible for verisimilitude unfortunately won the argument with the user interface designer. The original amp has this inconsistency in the pull labels, and Amplitube faithfully reproduced this by putting the LEDs where the labels were. The real amp did shade the positioning of these labels a little bit to help. End quirk. Let's simplify the interface and just talk about Rhythm 1, and I'll obscure the controls that don't affect the Rhythm 1 channel. We have 6 control knobs and 2 LED switches. The 3 control knobs in the middle are shared with the Rhythm 2 channel. The others only affect the Rhythm 1 channel. According to the Mesa manual, which I will link to in the description, the gain control stays pretty clean in this channel for most guitars until about 8. I find maxing out this channel still gives a pretty clean tone. The bright control is linked to the gain control. The more gain you use, the less effect the bright pull will have. The manual describes gains of 3 or 4 as providing super shimmer, and 6 or 7 as giving a realistic sound. The next control is for treble, and Mesa describes it as the predominant control. The range of 0 to 3 is described as suitable for warm jazz and as being dark, and compared to higher settings, this is a dramatic control. 5 through 7 is the normal range. The gain increases with higher treble settings. 2 shared controls are next. The circuitry is designed to maximize their effect when lower treble settings are used. The recommended range for bass is 0 through 3, and for mid it's 4 through 7. The next control is for Rhythm 1 presence. This adjusts frequencies above the treble control. Mesa recommends experimenting with opposite extremes for treble and presence. Turn one all the way up and the other all the way down, and use them with the bright pulled and pushed. The master volume allows you to compensate the volume for changes in the gain setting. Rhythm 2 strikes me as a much more versatile channel, and it's where I've spent most of my time experimenting. The gain control at lower settings seems to overlap the Rhythm 1 settings. but as you go up, it provides a lot more distortion. Coupled with the pull fat switch, you get maximum crunch. I have found for certain songs that I can use Rhythm 1 for clean sections and switch to Rhythm 2 for the lead and any other distorted sounds without the use of pedals. Mesa indicates that the shared controls have even less effect in Rhythm 2 than in Rhythm 1, but share the same dependency with the treble circuit. The Rhythm 2 presence knob works like the R1 version, but it is coupled with a pull shift. Click on the LED to affect an even higher frequency range with greater emphasis. The R2 master works like the R1's master and does just what you'd expect. The lead channel controls are mostly on the bottom row, and you get the additional lead drive control. The lead gain control affects how much signal will be available to the lead drive control. Mesa indicates that a gain of 7 will give a focus sound, and above 8, total saturation occurs. Using the pull fat switch reduces treble and emphasizes the lower mid-range. The treble control works similarly to the rhythm channels and is coupled to the bass and mid-range controls. Higher settings increase distortion and sustain. Bass and mid also work similarly to the rhythm channels. The lead drive comes on rapidly at low settings and then gradually through the rest of the range. Mesa recommends values of 2 to 4 for finding great sounds and a range of 5 to 7 to achieve that fully saturated sound. The lead bright control can add sizzle and gain to the highs. It comes with some warnings from the engineers, but since you can't damage the tubes in Amplitube and you have multiple ways to control the overall volume to protect your hearing, the warnings aren't that relevant to a simulation. Still, their general recommendation is to leave the bright switch off for high gain / volume settings and pull it for lower settings. The presence and master controls work similarly to the rhythm channels. The manual does warn that too much presence at high gain / drive settings can, quote, aggravate the spin out of squealing and excess noise, end quote. That doesn't sound good. And that brings us to sidebar quirk number 2. There are a number of understandable differences between the controls for the real amp and a simulation. However, there is a Nigel Tufnell issue here. The real amp has dials that go from 0 to 10. The simulation knobs go from 1 to 10. By itself, I'm not sure that's worth mentioning, except you'll notice that the actual values for the knob progress through the original amp's range of 0 through 10. So when your knob has the number 1 at noon, you are on volume 0. With 5, you will have a value close to 4.4, and 10 will show 10. If you're trying to copy a sound by looking at a real amp, just remember to adjust the values by the number shown in the pop-up box, not the position of the dials. End quirk. The graphic EQ section affects all the channels. The EQ LED turns on or off the equalizer. Mesa recommends starting with the classic V shape. They don't provide hard values, but I use 7.5 for the 80 and 6.6 kilohertz bands, 6 for the 240 and 2.2 kilohertz bands, and 1.7 for the 750 band. They further recommend that you adjust the outer 4 bands first and then shape the final sound with the 750 band. And you might think that does it, but there's one more important button on the face. The back button rotates our amp 180 degrees. While you can't change out the fuse, you can adjust the reverb from here. You can also shape the sound in some unique ways. Switching to pentode powers up 2 additional tubes to increase the power. Mesa indicates this will provide more punch and a harder clip. I have trouble hearing the subtle changes due to the volume increase, but the manual says this, quote, triode lowers the power and softens and smooths the onset of a clip. This makes it easier to get a rich singing sound full of sustain and harmonics, but some headroom is sacrificed for this sweeter response, end quote. When the next switch is set to Class A, the 2 outer 6L6 power tubes are turned on. In the simul class, I don't know how to say that, position, all 4 tubes are turned on. A nice touch would have been to have the tube graphics change. In the real amp, the combination of these 2 switches gives 30, 50, 75, or 80 watts of power. With Class 8 and Triode, you get 30 watts, and with Pentode Simul, you get 80. This brings us to quirk number 3. This strikes me as a pretty faithful simulation of many of the Mark IV features, so it's somewhat surprising that the option for Tweed power is missing. Frankly, I feel like I already have more than enough options, but I can imagine someone that owns the original and likes Tweed power settings will be disappointed. Among some benefits to tube life and overall volume, the manual has this to say about Tweed power. Quote, Tweed power works like a built-in variac, reducing all the internal voltages for a spongy vintage feeling and an extraordinary brown sound. End quote. Finally, we have the Harmonics/mid-gain switch. This has an effect on the lead channel only. The mid-gain position is designed to increase gain and sustain. It has a more noticeable punch effect when the lead drive setting is low. At higher lead drive settings, it will add extra boost, but high drive with pull switches activated can lead to generally undesirable noisy effects. Mesa recommends using the Harmonics setting for high-gain lead playing. The manual also states that, quote, to duplicate the sounds of our fabled Mark II-C, switches should be set for Harmonics and Triode with the presence controls pulled out, end quote. I've set up 5 model presets per recommendations by Mesa, and I'll sample all 15 sounds to give you some idea about how this simulation sounds. I'll also share the preset files, so if you'd like to hear that and experiment with those settings yourselves, I'll see you in the next video.